old friends, Camera Raw, smart objects, shop vlog. Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. And today we're going to have episode 7 of the shop vlog, a special edition of the shop vlog where I'm going to be editing a guest's artist image. I'm going to put my artistic interpretation on top of their image, independent of their original vision of the photograph. But I'm also going to be dropping some Photoshop knowledge today, specifically exploring smart objects in Photoshop. We're going to talk about what they are, why you would want to use them, and the common ways of using them to work non-destructively on your artwork in Photoshop. So, enough of the talky-talky. Let's hit the Photoshop and begin the journey of episode 7 of the shop vlog. Introductions, as always, to get us started. This original image was captured by Sherry Hulse with Sherry Hulse Photography. You can see more of her amazing artwork by visiting the Instagram account at the link below. Sherry and I have known each other for a very long time. She and her husband Bill and her daughter Emily were some of the original clients I had when I started my studio and my journey in photography long ago. We would see each other every year as clients, and then a few years back we ran into each other at a photography conference that I teach at called Shutterfest. And I was so excited to run into her because she was there as a student. She was beginning her journey into photography and into art. And it was like coming full circle. She was there at the beginning of mine, and I got to be there at the beginning of hers. They're wonderful human beings. They're like family to me. They were a part of my life when I didn't know how far my path and journey in photography and art would go. They were a part of all the emotions of the success and failures of it, and I've been a part of hers. And it means a lot to me. So Sherry, thank you so much, my friend, for sending this file and letting me edit it today on my YouTube channel. Yet again, another journey that I'm going on and you're a part of it. I am proud of you. I am proud that you have persisted and pushed through to continue to create and pursue this passion. Use that passion, use your imagination to carry you forward on this path. And I will always be here for you, my friend, anytime you need me. I am proud of you. So, enough with the Oprah. Let's get to the editing today. So we're inside of Adobe Camera Raw, and I'm going to be editing this image in Adobe Camera Raw and taking it to its final art only using Adobe Camera Raw. I've talked about this in previous videos on the channel that I typically use Adobe Camera Raw to prepare a file to go into Photoshop. And then in Photoshop, I do all the artistic enhancement. But I want to use ACR today to do it Adobe Camera Raw, and here's the reason why. Because as people are stepping into digital photography and learning the beginnings of that, they inevitably start turning to digital photo editing. I have said that in the equation of art, digital photography is only one half of that equation. The other half, in my humble opinion, is digital photo editing. They go hand in hand, they're one and the same. Because only you, as the artist with the original vision, can bring it to life. So as people continue to explore digital photo editing, they will turn to a program like Adobe Lightroom. Which is fine. It gives a lot of agency to people who are stepping into editing for the first time. The interface itself is very easy and intuitive to use. You look at an image like this and you say, okay, well, there's certain sections that are too bright. You see the word exposure here in the slider. You move it, you see an instantaneous result. The problem is, inevitably, your skill set and knowledge will surpass the capabilities of Adobe Lightroom. You'll start to want to create different types of edits, things that are beyond the capabilities of Lightroom, and that's where Photoshop will come into play. Inevitably, you'll have to start making that journey to Photoshop. Adobe Camera Raw can be that bridge between Lightroom and Photoshop. The Develop module inside of Lightroom is literally built on the infrastructure of Adobe Camera Raw. They're almost identical. In Adobe Camera Raw, you have the same controls, you have the same tools. You can batch process images in Adobe Camera Raw. If you were to open multiple RAW files, they would appear down here in a film strip. You can make changes to them, sync those changes. You can save the files as JPEGs and export them and never once open them into Photoshop or have to open them into Lightroom. So there's so much you can do with ACR. So I want to edit this image today showing you that process in Adobe Camera Raw and touching on some of the fundamentals of editing that I've talked about. And this is for the beginner-friendly content on the channel. Those fundamentals of editing are color, luminosity, and detail. We use that as a guide to figure out what to do with the file. So we're going to do that today using this interface. And you can use Adobe Camera Raw at any stage during the process in Photoshop. You're in Photoshop and you're working and you're like, I need to add more exposure to this image and I don't remember how. Is it an adjustment layer? What's the menu that I do it? You can go to Adobe Camera Raw as a filter at any stage in the process and call back to these controls. So as you continue to expand your knowledge in Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw will always be that bridge. Now, to be able to edit the image today to final art using Adobe Camera Raw, I'm going to need multiple versions of the file, which means I will have to open it from Adobe Camera Raw into Photoshop, duplicate it, and then bring the duplicate back into ACR. We may have to do that 2 or 3 times. That's where the smart objects are going to come into play. What is a smart object? It's essentially a file structure that protects a layer, an image, anything that you convert to a smart object or open as a smart object. When you make changes to an image in Photoshop, when you convert it from a raw file into Photoshop, you make changes in Photoshop, you change the exposure, you change the image size, you crop it. That's a process of compression of all the information in the file. Every time that happens, a little bit of that data is lost. You take an 8x10 and you image size it down to a 5x7. That data is lost. It's being compressed down into a new file size, an image size of 5x7. So to be able to do that, it has to get rid of some of the data. That's an irrevocable change to the file. If it's a smart object, it protects all of that information. This isn't true, but in a way, it actually doesn't make the changes to the file. That's how it protects the data. It builds a catalog of stuff that you want to do to the file called smart filters. Now, today we're going to explore 2 common uses of smart objects. There's many uses. We're going to explore 2 of them. And we'll start with Adobe Camera Raw and one of the common uses of a smart object. And then a little bit later, we'll show you how to make those smart filters and what they mean by using a smart object inside of Photoshop. But let's get started with the edit. Let's look at the image and talk about the photography. So this is obviously natural light. And I love this image because there's story instantaneously. It's implicit. I don't know who this young lady is. I don't know why she was Sherry's client, what they were doing, what the whole vision of the session was, but she's sitting on the steps of a building. Is this her apartment, condo? Is she starting her own career in photography? She's holding a camera, and if she is starting her career, she's off on the wrong foot because she's holding an Nikon, and that's a hot mess. Just kidding. There's nothing wrong with Nikon. So anyway, in natural light photography, if you don't use an off-camera flash or artificial light, everybody faces this problem. And the question is, where is the light coming from? Where's the sun coming from? And how is it going to screw up my picture? Because you need to expose the camera for the subject, which means that inevitably at some point, something in the background is going to be overexposed and blown out. So in this situation, you set up a person on the steps of this building that has meaning to them, and we're going forward with this pose. We encounter one of 2 problems. Either A, it's like, okay, well, look, the sun's a problem here. So even though this place has meaning, let's move to somewhere else where there's like the shade of a building, the shade of a tree. We wait for an overcast day so we don't have to fight the sun. Or B, we'll just Photoshop it. We'll fix the problems in Photoshop. So as I look at the image, I see the parts that are properly exposed and they look good. But obviously the trade-off is then the parts where the sun was directly hitting the subject in the background, they're overexposed. So going back to the fundamentals of editing, the first thing that I want to do is to address luminosity. So I'm simply going to look at the image and say, okay, I got to fix these hot spots. Now, I would wager because she's wearing a white t-shirt, she's got the white in the jeans, that there might be some data loss here. Because if it's overexposed just enough where there's data loss, then that means there's no pixels there to recover at all. And that can cause problems both from a highlights perspective and a shadows perspective, in either overexposing or underexposing when you try to fix that. Because if there isn't pixel information there, you're going to start seeing artifacts and noise and all kinds of issues because there's just not data to recover. There's an easy way to tell that in an image in Adobe Camera Raw, and that's to come up to the histogram here, and we can turn on shadow clipping and highlight clipping by clicking these 2 little droplet Hershey Kiss looking thingies. So I'm going to click this one for the shadow clipping and then click this one. Now, we definitely have highlight clipping, unfortunately, but we don't have any shadow clipping. The highlight clipping is showing up as these red spots here, and that's indicating to us that in these areas of overexposure, there's just not any more data there to recover. We are not, as we start pulling the highlights down of all these overexposed areas, we're not going to see like weird, bizarre checkerboard pattern or does not compute or something along those lines. It's going to look okay. And in this realm, when I look at this, this is a minimal amount of data loss. This is totally fine. Now, if her whole shirt and the steps was red because of the highlight clipping turned on, then we've got a problem. But in this case, I don't think this is going to be noticeable. If there was any loss in the shadows, we would see it as like a light blue, I believe, in the same kind of way. So I'm going to turn these two off. And when I think about the highlights, when I think about the overexposure, I don't want to just move the exposure. Why? It's a global change to the entire exposure of the entire scene. If we think about this, the properly exposed parts look fine. If we start bringing the exposure down, we're going to make those no longer properly exposed. We just need to take care of the highlights. So here for the highlight slider, that should solve the problem almost immediately. And since this is a raw file, we have all of the original data from the shot itself. So I'm going to take the highlights down pretty significantly. The stairs look great. The building looks great. Her shirt looks good. There's a couple of spots that may look just a little weird, almost in color. And that's a part of the process, especially when you have something like a white shirt or a source of white that's overexposed. It may feel like it's dirty or there's a shadow on it or so forth. That's some of the transition of that data trying to be recovered. But I think this actually looks pretty good right there. So we're -65, we'll go to -70. I think we're fine right there. I'm going to go ahead and take the white point down as well just a little bit. This is reassessing all of the data everywhere. And we're making a change to the information of this image. So those are the only two things right now that I want to address from that luminosity perspective. So now at this point, I need to open a version of this with those minor changes, then duplicate the layer and take the new duplicate back into Photoshop and start addressing the rest of the image that is properly exposed. If I were to just come down and hit open, it's going to convert the raw file to a file format of PSD, and then that's what's processed inside of Photoshop. That conversion has a data transfer and change. I don't want that to happen. Now, part of that data transfer and change, yes, some of the data can be lost and that Smart Object will protect that, but I want to convert this to a Smart Object before I open it for another reason. And this is the first most common use of a Smart Object. If I open this raw file into Photoshop as a Smart Object, the raw file will stay a raw file. It will not be a PSD file, which means I can reopen it from Photoshop back into Adobe Camera Raw, and it will be exactly as it is right now. It will reopen. I will have the highlights being -70, the white point being -27. Why is that important? Well, let's say I make these changes right now and I do not convert this to a Smart Object. I don't open it as a Smart Object. I just hit open and it converts to a PSD file. Then I say, you know what? Those highlights, they looked better when it was overexposed. Go with me on this. So then I want to undo what I just did. If I open the file again using Adobe Camera Raw as a filter, it's a PSD file now. Those changes of highlights and the white point has been pushed down into the pixels. So when I open it back into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter, first, there's conversion, so there's data loss, but more importantly, the highlights and the whites will be back to 0. And I have to build and try to undo on top of something that's already been done. I cannot literally go back a step. Now, I can go back a step in my history. That's a different part of this. So for the educational purposes of the beginner-friendly content here, for folks who are new to this, follow along with me on this, that if I open this as a Smart Object, it's the best way to keep the file protected, the data protected, and to have agency to go back to make changes. So to open this as a Smart Object, when I come down here to open, if I hold the Shift key, it's going to switch from the word open to Open Object. When I click it, it will now open this file as a Smart Object. Now, I've actually already opened the raw file one time. I didn't make any changes at all, and I simply did it so that we would have a before and after version of the file to look at. The way to tell that this is a Smart Object is here's the original file name. It doesn't say the word background, as it does here. This has just been opened. It's been converted to be a PSD file, and it says background and it's locked. this is a smart object that has the name, doesn't say background, and there's this little icon in the bottom corner. This means this is a smart object. So now if I double click it, the thumbnail of the layer, the smart object, I go back into Adobe Camera Raw, instantaneously here are those changes. We are right back to where we were before. That's the common use of a smart object and why it's so important. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel because I need a duplicate of this smart object so I can start working with the rest of the image that was properly exposed. Now, this is incredibly important and it can be a little confusing. When we make a duplicate in Photoshop, typically we would hit Control or Command and the letter J for duplicate. You can go up to Layer and Duplicate, Layer here. You can right-click anywhere on the layer where there isn't words or the thumbnail, and it'll bring up a menu, and at the top you can do Duplicate Layer. If I duplicate the layer, it is literally a duplicate of it. Think of it as those two layers, especially with smart objects. Think of it as they are linked. So a duplicate is just a living, literal duplicate of the smart object. So if I duplicate the smart object by hitting Control or Command letter J, and I take that second copy back into Adobe Camera Raw, and I make some further changes and then say OK and come back to Photoshop, because they're duplicates, they're linked, both files will change at the same time. I don't want that. I want this one, where we brought the highlights down, to stay just as it is, because I want to make a duplicate, make some changes, and then use layer masks in Photoshop to combine them. So to be able to do that, to get the duplicate that will not be linked and preserve this first raw smart object, I'm going to right-click anywhere where there's not a word or the thumbnail and come over to New Smart Object via Copy. Click it. Now this is the confusing part. When we make a duplicate, Control or Command and letter J, it will say the name of the file and say the word copy. We're made a new smart object via copy, which means this is an entirely separate file from this one. So if I make changes to this smart object in Adobe Camera Raw and export it back into Photoshop, we'll see the changes on this layer, but not this one. So I'm going to double click the icon, the thumbnail. We'll go back into Adobe Camera Raw. Instantaneously, since it's a new smart object via copy, it remembered all the information of the original smart object that we opened. So we have the highlights and the white point here. We can make some further changes if we want to, and we will probably move those sliders again as we start addressing the rest of the image. Now again, back to those principles of editing, color, luminosity, detail. The first thing I want to do for the rest of the image that's been properly exposed, I'm going to go ahead and push up the exposure just a little bit globally. Now, as I do this, it is making those troubled spots of the highlights that we just brought down, it's making those brighter. This is why I wanted to use a smart object, because in a way, it's like I'm opening this for the first time. I can continue to make changes here and here. And you would say, well, then if you can do that, why not just do that the very first time you open it in Adobe Camera Raw? Take the highlights and the whites down, increase the exposure. That would absolutely work. But keep in mind, because I have this first layer here in the layer stack that definitely preserved all those highlights, I can use a layer mask to paint down and be able to pull this original layer up and through to make a new combined layer, a new combined image. This is digital photo editing. So I'm going to keep the highlights and whites there. Let's go exposure just a little bit more. And right now I'm looking at the right side of her face because I want to make sure that that looks pretty good, as well as the left side not getting too overexposed. So I'm going to bring it back down to plus 45. I think it looks pretty good. Let's take the shadows out just a touch. That's going to help us to see a little bit more detail everywhere where there's shadows in play. And then I'm going to pull the black point out just a little bit more. This is kind of lessening it everywhere, and in a way, it's kind of making the image a little bit brighter. It's not actually adding light to the scene. It's just reevaluating all the data based upon a new black point. That's what happens with the white slider and the black slider here. So pulling those out just a touch, I think that looks fine. Again, we're only thinking about luminosity right now for this pass with the image. So I think that's all balanced relatively well. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Now it's going to process and prepare. So when we look at this smart object via copy, this second layer, we see those changes. But if I turn it off, we're back to the one where everything else is where it was, but those highlights and the white point was definitely brought down. I have a layer that I can call to. It's like getting all the tools, the ingredients that you need to make a beautiful, wonderful photography cake. Pie, cookies. Anyway, so we have this. Now we understand what's going on. Everything looks pretty good at this point. So I like the way these two exist. I'm going to now put that layer mask onto this top layer by clicking the layer mask icon here in the layers window. This is a white layer or a white layer mask or a reveal all, which means this entire layer is visible. If I start painting black onto this layer, it will start hiding anywhere where I paint black of this layer so that the one beneath will be visible. So I'm going to be painting black onto the white parts that were overexposed, so I can see this bottom smart object that we created. I'm going to hit B for brush, make sure that my foreground color is set to black. My opacity is 100%. I'm going to change my flow to 10% by hitting Shift and the number 1 key. And then I'm going to start painting black onto that section here on the mask. Let me make sure that I'm on my actual soft round brush. Okay, there we go. And so I'm painting onto the mask in those areas that we know were overexposed earlier. And this is just calling us back down to the first smart object that we opened, and we can really just use all of that information there for the lowest highlights and shadows part. And if we find that it's not enough after we do the layer mask itself, the beauty of smart objects is I can just simply double click the layer icon here of our first smart object, go right back into Adobe Camera Raw, and it has just the changes that we made here of the highlights and the whites. So I can take them down even further. Take the white point down even further and hit OK. It's going to process it. And so now, because this layer mask, anywhere where it's painted black, I can see this layer now. We've reduced it just a little bit more. So with these two layers together, it looks pretty good. Now what I want to do is to make a new layer that is a combination of these two. And this is where we're going to end with the smart objects at this point, because they have served their purpose by protecting the file when we open it as a raw file to keep it as a raw file. And you saw here the reason why, because I wanted to have luminosity values in one part of it and then be able to have luminosity values in another part of it and combine them together. Now, subsequently, just for you folks who are more intermediate users of Photoshop, yes, you can use adjustment brushes inside of Adobe Camera Raw to paint all of that. That is a little bit of a complex process, and please also keep in mind that part of my goal with these videos is to be able to show people how to get into Photoshop and start using Photoshop. So this is just trying to address those folks that may say, well, dude, you don't have to do all this, just use the adjustment brush. Yes, I know, but I want to show folks how to get into Photoshop and start using things like layer masks and so forth, because these are really integral parts of understanding why things work in Photoshop. So I want to make a combo of these two layers. And to do that, I'm going to select the topmost layer, and I'm going to, well, there's a couple of different ways. Let's explore them. I want to essentially push both of these down. So I can right click the layer mask itself. You know what? I can't do that because it's a smart object. My bad. So let's explore this. Teaching moment here. I wasn't planning on this for the video, but we're going to go for it anyway. So once you have a smart object, there are certain things you can't do to the file that you typically can in Photoshop simply because it's a smart object. It's a complication with the software. So not a problem, it's just a part of the way the software works. So if I want to accept this layer mask and I right click it, I don't have apply layer mask as an option. I can simply delete it, but I don't have a way to apply it. And I was going to do that so I can combine both of the layers. I can convert this now from a smart object back to a normal layer, and it's called Rasterize. So I'm going to right click anywhere on the layer where there's not a word or a thumbnail and come down to where it says Rasterize layer. When I do this, it turns it into just a normal layer now. It's no longer a smart object. So if I were to double click this icon, it's not going to take me into Adobe Camera Raw anymore. It's going to take me into the layer styles dialog. So I'm going to click cancel for that. So I'm going to right click the layer mask itself and apply layer mask. So all those changes were applied and made, and now I can flatten these two. Because if we look at this layer by itself, all of this checkerboard means that that part's missing from the layer mask we painted because we just applied the layer mask to it. So now with these two combined, if I flatten them, they will become one layer, and all of that will be combined into itself. To flatten, just simply come up to layer, and down here where it says flatten image. So when I do, we now have a new background layer that's locked. This is typical if we had not opened the file from Adobe Camera Raw as a smart object. We would just see a normal layer that says background, and all of that's been combined. Now, I want to show you how to take this image back into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. And keep in mind, you can do this at any stage in the process of Photoshop. So with this layer selected, I'm simply going to come up to Filter and down to where it says Camera Raw Filter. I can also use the hotkeys of Shift, Control, and A. What I do, I'm going to go back into Adobe Camera Raw. There has been conversion. This is no longer a raw file now. It's not like just because we used Adobe Camera Raw that we converted the file back to raw. It's just a standard layer now in Photoshop. But this is a way to get this interface to start working with the image, and subsequently how we're going to proceed forward with the art edit here. So now let's go back to the fundamentals: color, luminosity, detail. We've done luminosity. Let's look at color. So I want to start increasing color and some of the tones that we see overall, which does touch upon luminosity just a little bit. And these are some simple things that are basic, but because they're basic means you have a lot of freedom to explore and to experiment, especially if you're new to photo editing and using Photoshop or Adobe Camera Raw. So first and foremost, I'm just going to increase the contrast just a little bit. That always gives a wonderful push to the tonal quality, both of color and light in the scene. I'm going to push the white point just a little bit, and I'm going to bring the black point back down now, just because we're starting to now globally look at the image. I'm no longer worrying about the hot spots. We've already taken care of that with the two smart objects. So let's pull the shadows out just again, get a little bit more detail. I'm seeing more detail up here in the door as I move the shadow. Here was where it was, here's where it is. So we're starting to see that. But just always be cognizant as you start pulling things like shadows or highlights, you can start introducing noise. So as I pull this shadow slider back down to 0, we don't see a lot of noise, especially a lot of color noise in the image, but as I pull it out, we start seeing some of that here. Now, in a natural light image like this, where that noise is the furthest in the background, it's not that big of a deal, but it certainly could be in other areas like the jeans and the shadow regions. That's just a part of the process. So as you push things in Photoshop and edit, just be careful how far you go. So in this case, I'm not having too much trouble with that noise there. I think everything looks fine. I like seeing more of that detail there. I'm going to push the white slider just a little bit more because it's giving us a more good light tonal value and addressing some of the color too at the same time. Now, texture, clarity, and dehaze here, these definitely fall into the realm of color, luminosity, detail, and we can certainly work on that detail part of those fundamentals of Photoshop. Texture is always one that I love to use. It's going to give an overall sharpness, if you will, to the image. This is different from actually coming to the detail slider here and adding sharpening. The sharpening is increasing. I'm not going to get into that technical explanation, but texture is a wonderful way to start adding more of that detail back into the scene. Clarity is like HDR, a high dynamic range. So it's a very stylized look, especially if you take it too far all the way up. I've never been a fan of HDR because I always feel like it makes any image look a little too dirty and just grungy, and I don't like that. But a little touch of clarity certainly can help, both from a luminosity perspective to boost it just a little bit and the overall details of the scene. Vibrant saturation, always easy just to push those just a touch on either on both of them. But now that we're in the realm of color of those fundamentals, let's look at the colors that we see. We've got the red in the bricks, the blue in her jeans, red, yellow, orange in her hair, yellow and orange in her skin tone. And I've talked about previous videos on the channel in the retouching series how every human being on earth has yellow and orange in their skin tone regardless of their ethnicity. If you're new to the channel, by the way, welcome. If you've never seen the retouching series, take a look at the card above. It will take you to that when you're done with this one today. There's a lot of great information in there about retouching. So ultimately, looking at this in color, I can continue to boost the vibrance and the saturation. It's going to boost everything globally, but I want a little bit more control over it. So I'm going to come down to the color mixer here in Adobe Camera Raw. This is one of my favorite tabs here. This used to be called the HSL tab, or the Hue, Saturation, Luminance tab. In the newest version of Photoshop, which is what I'm using, I'm a part of the Adobe Creative Cloud program where you get Photoshop, Lightroom, and Bridge for a small amount of money every month. With this newest version of Adobe Camera Raw, this interface changed just a little bit. So I'm going to come to the blue slider here. I'm going to increase the saturation just a little bit. And I'm seeing just the saturation of blue in her jeans increase. If I take it all the way up, of course, there's blue in other places in the scene, like the bars here on her shirt and so forth. This is just always a fun experiment as a way to see colors that you may not have saw at first glance, but as you move this up, you can definitely see where it comes into play and where there might be some contamination of blue. And this is key to work with this because we can start to shift the hues of these colors if we need to start balancing things out. Now with the blue, we don't need to change the hue. I'm just simply increasing the saturation. But let's go to the orange slider and let's start thinking about color balance in her skin, because again, our goal here is to edit this image to its final art using Adobe Camera Raw. So when I look at this in her skin, I want to balance out the skin tones. There is definitely red in her skin tone. It's not as prevalent as orange and yellow, but it's there. But more importantly, the orange and yellow that's there, they can be closer to the red side of the spectrum of orange than the yellows and oranges. So think about it, red, orange, yellow, right in the spectrum. Well, that orange right here in the center, if it's this part of orange that's closer to red instead of this part that's closer to yellow, we're going to see color shift in the skin. Part of unifying the colors and trying to balance them is to be able to shift the orange back the other way. If it's too red, start taking it to yellow. If the yellow is too orange, start taking it to green. If the red is too orange, start taking it to the purple side of the spectrum of red. Those are color shifts, color balance, color correction. Now, many different ways to do this in Photoshop. There's third-party plugins like Infinite Unify, which is a fantastic third-party plugin for Photoshop that gives you wonderful ability to unify colors and skin tones and so forth. There's a video on the channel about it if you want to look for that. So we're going to do it in ACR. So I'm going to come to the orange sliders and let's simply take the saturation down. So instantaneously we can see there is some red there because we removed all the saturation of orange from the image. We see those different reds. So let's go to the red slider. Now this is where hue comes into play. If I start shifting the hue of red toward orange, those red spots are going to start blending more with the color orange than they are going to be in reds and magentas and purples. So let's start taking this and moving it this way. But when we do, her lip color is changing as well. So it's something to be cognizant of as we start balancing all these colors. Let's go back to orange and bring the saturation back to 0 instead of -100. Now we'll go back to red and start shifting the hue and just see how the lip color comes into play. So the lip color is changing too much to make one broad stroke of a change with this layer using ACR. We need to duplicate the layer and paint that in as a layer mask. So I'm not actually going to make any changes right now with this. I'm just going to kind of store it away as the next thing I want to do. So we know from a color perspective, some of the things that we want to do. I just hit Control Command and the number 0 to zoom all the way back out. So I want to just continue to address some of the other global things that we can do. We've done the texture clarity, vibrance, and saturation here. We can go to the curve and certainly start working with the curve as well to deal with adding luminosity values and contrast, but I prefer to do it here in the basic tabs, again, for that beginner-friendly content. So at this point, I think we've really done what we can do with the basics here, so I'm going to say okay. And now we've got a nice starting foundation. There's a few more things we can do and start working with it in certain key areas, but I'm liking what I see already, so I think this is relatively fine. So what I want to do now is duplicate the layer, not make a new smart object via copy. So I'm going to use the traditional method of hitting Control Command and the letter J. And now I have a duplicate, so we have background and layer 1. These are duplicates of each other, but since they're not smart objects, I can make changes to this one and it will not affect the background layer, the one below. So with layer number 1 active, I'm going to go back into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. The hotkeys are Control Shift and A or Command Shift and A on a Mac. We'll go back into the program itself. That's where I'm going to come down now to the red slider, take the hue over significantly. The bricks changed a lot too, so we definitely need to fix that. I'm going to increase the saturation just a touch and the luminance just a little bit to try to help it blend with some of the brighter oranges that I saw in her skin. Then hit OK. Now I need to put a layer mask onto this so that I can ultimately take it away from just her lips. So using the layer mask icon here in the layers window, click it, we have the white mask. We're painting with our foreground color of black. Opacity of 100, flow of 10%, and simply hide this top layer on her lips so that the original lip color comes through with the reds in it, but we balanced out all the other red shifts we saw here in her skin. And most importantly, the reds of the brick are pretty much staying where they were before, and everything can be, no, I'm sorry, no, because we need to use the layer mask for it. So I was thinking ahead to the next thing I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to just paint black onto the layer mask where the bricks are to return all of that original red that we saw, and especially over here. There we go. And I don't think there were any other major sources of red in this that we needed to preserve, so I think we're good at this point with that. So now, again, I want to flatten these two down. So I'm going to come to Layer and Flatten Image, so we have one layer to deal with again. Let's go back into ACR and explore some of the other options there for a little bit more of an artistic finalization to the image. So I'm going to duplicate the layer, Control or Command letter J, go into ACR as a filter by hitting Control Shift and A or Command Shift and A on a Mac. Now we've done all the basics up here that we care to do. We can certainly give it more texture and clarity if we want to, but that's not necessary at this point. I'm not going to deal with, we can add sharpness to it, that's fine, but I want to show you another way to add sharpness actually using Photoshop and talk about smart objects in the second way that they're commonly used. Let's come down to split toning. Split toning, I've talked about in the retouching series as the poor man's color grade. It's an easy way to add two different colors to the scene that can really give it an artistic boost. And the way this works is very simple. If we look at this right now, all these numbers are zeros, and that's important because if we start taking the highlights, we're going to add a color to the overall brightness in this scene. If I start moving this slider around, nothing happens, even though this number is changing. Visibly, nothing is changing because saturation is still at 0. If we take the saturation up just a little bit, like let's say 14, sounds good to me, then it's a minimal change. And as we move this around, we start to see some colors coming into the highlights in the scene. So I'm going to deal with the same balance that we have here of the colors that we see. We see red and blue as some of the strong colors. So in the highlights, I'm going to put a little bit of red, yellow, orange in there in that hue and just push it a little bit right through there. Then I'm going to come down to where it says shadows here. I'm going to increase the saturation to 14 again, and now I'm going to change the hue to blue. So we're adding just a little bit of blue into the shadow regions in this scene. And this slider here for balance is at 0. These were equally balanced between highlights and shadows. Neither one of these is being favored over the other. So I can favor it by moving the balance one way or the other. I can also subsequently increase the saturation of one of these to make them more prevalent than the other one. But at this point, I think this looks fine. I'm going to go ahead, and I want to pull down the yellows and oranges just a touch. So I'm going to take the saturation point to 10. My favorite color is blue. I'm biased. So ultimately, I'm leaving the blue be a little bit stronger into the scene. I just like the overall feel. If you don't, you can increase, the saturation of the highlights. You don't even have to use split toning. You can do this in many other ways, but this is one of the uses of Adobe Camera Raw that's an option for us. So this is kind of that little touch of a color grade. I think it looks fine in the image. We've given it some feeling, but let's go ahead and come back up to the basics and just give it a little bit more contrast now, because we've changed some colors. We've given it more of a artistic feeling, and I want to just push that contrast one more time. We'll take the shadows out just a little bit more, and then let's go ahead and increase the white point one more time, increase the black point. We'll pull the highlights down just a touch again, and maybe just one little more push of exposure, just a little gentle touch. I think that was too much. Let's go back to 0 for the exposure. Exposure is a very heavy-handed change. It happens very quickly with this slider. So ultimately, I think overall, this looks fine. There's one last thing that I want to do with this, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. We have our nice layer. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this layer. I don't need to flatten it down as we've done before. I'm just going to go ahead and hit Control or Command letter J, get this third copy, go back into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter by hitting Control Shift and A or Command Shift and A. And I'm going to create a simple vignette. A vignette is a wonderful way to pull the audience's focus to the center of the image or the subject of your image. And a vignette is simply darkening the outer perimeter of it. This is, to this day, the way that I create vignettes now most of the time. So coming to the exposure slider, I'm simply going to decrease the exposure by a stop and a half, 1.50, and then hit OK. Now we have this top layer where it's super dark, and we have the layer in between, which is the one that was the kind of final art that we were creating. So for this, I'm going to put a white mask onto it, and I'm going to start painting black to remove this dark layer. Where do I want to start? Well, let's definitely start on the subject. I'm going to go ahead and change my flow of my brush to 100% from 10% by hitting the Shift key and the 0 key at the same time. So I'm making sure to keep my brush right inside the subject, and I want to take this off of most of her. I'm going to leave some of the vignette onto the right side of her body or the side of her body that's in shadow already, because part of the vignette's job is to certainly pull focus for the audience, but also you can help play up the luminosity value in the scene by leaving some of the vignette in the areas that make sense for shadow. Now I'm going to change the flow of my brush back to 10% by hitting Shift and the number 1 key, because I need to build this effect up now. I need more control. So I'm going to look at all the other light spots on the stones, the wall, the doors, everywhere. And since I have a flow of 10%, I can just paint a little bit and start building it up in all these little key areas, all over the door here, up there, and so forth. So I've made sure that those got addressed first. And now I'm going to step a few paces back, zooming out of my document by hitting Control or Command and the minus key. And then I'm going to make my brush really big by using my right bracket key. And now I'm simply just going to go like this over the entire image and just give it a little bit of wash of black everywhere on the mask. And let's hit the bottom here too, just a little bit. Computer's taking just a moment to catch up. Always happens when I record content. I have a very powerful computer, but over time it just takes a little while to catch up. So if we look at our layer mask, I'm holding the Alt or Option key and clicking the layer mask so I can see where we actually painted. Think about this. Anything that's black is hiding the darkness of this layer, the vignette that we created. So we made sure that it was completely off of her. Then we hit these hot spots that we know exist already into the image and then just gave it just a little bit of a wash of black. So we have a vignette that helps to focus the audience to her and to this scene and plays up and embraces the natural light that's there. Let's do the before and after. Here's the before without the vignette, zooming in just a little bit, and after. Before and after. If you're new to the channel, again, welcome. You may have not heard me say this in the past, but one of the things I constantly teach all the time is that subtlety is key inside of Photoshop. So we don't have this massive spotlight of a vignette. It's very minimal, but it's helping to just build up with other minimal, subtle things to drive us into the scene and create some of this artwork. So this to me is finished as far as what I would want to do to artistically enhance an image inside of Adobe Camera Raw. And it's a relatively easy process because you have the agency of all the sliders and the controls, use the layer system and layer mask to be able to build up the different layers to combine the final art to what you want it to be. Now, the last thing I wanted to show was the smart object and the second most popular or common use of it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a duplicate layer of all of these so I will have one by itself. So you know what? No, that's not necessary. Let's stay with what we were doing. Let's go to layer and flatten. And now we're flattening everything down into one layer itself. I'm going to convert this background layer to a smart object and I'm going to duplicate it. This is just for teaching purposes. I just need a layer that I can convert to a smart object and I don't want to deal with why backgrounds are, forget it. So I'm going to right click anywhere where there's not a word or the thumbnail and come down to convert smart object. So I now have this layer. Once it's done, there we go. Now we have the smart object. It doesn't change the name. We just have that little icon here in the corner. This is a smart object. Keep in mind, this is a smart object that I cannot double click and go into ACR as we did at the beginning. That only happens when we open a raw file in ACR and choose to open that raw file as a smart object into Photoshop. It's still a raw file. So in this case with the smart object here, one of the common uses of a smart object is to ultimately be able to work on something non-destructively. What does that mean? When you're working on a file, you make changes to it. You sharpen it, you image size it, you crop it, you do whatever. That's called destructive working. You're changing the file each time. Now, you can save every single time you make one little change. You can save multiple copies of the file, but that's kind of not efficient for time. So being able to work non-destructively is key for a lot of different reasons. Commonly for you, if you're making some changes to the file, like think way back, a while ago when we were making some changes like the highlights and shadows. And then we say, oh man, I went too far with those changes. I need to go back. Well, if you don't have the history states in Photoshop to be able to go back, then those changes are forever permanent and you would have to start all over. That's working destructively. When I work for a commercial company and I do any kind of commercial work, I have to work non-destructively, which means that all the things that I do, as much as possible, I need to be able to preserve the file and those changes so that they can be changed at any other point through the entire process of the art creation itself. That's where the smart objects come into play because of the smart filters. So let me demonstrate what the smart filters will look like. Let's say I have this smart object and I want to go into Adobe Camera Raw and make a change. I'm going to go and sharpen it in Adobe Camera Raw. So I hit Control-Shift-A, Command-Shift-and-A on a Mac, scroll up to where it says Detail here, and let's increase the sharpening. We'll take some of the noise out and some of the color noise out at the same time. Let's go a little bit more in the sharpening. Zooming in. Let's take the sharpening down. You see how much the sharpening is affecting this. This is different than the texture slider here. So we're increasing the sharpening. That looks good. We're going to hit OK. It's going to process the Camera Raw filter. Because this was a smart object, now we have this new icon that looks like a layer mask, but it's, well, it actually technically is. And then this is a smart filter, and it shows us the catalog of things that were done and what's happened. So it's now showing Camera Raw filter. This did make a change to the file. It literally did, but it's also built as a list of things so that if I want to undo what I did, all I have to do is double click the word Camera Raw filter. Let's make a couple more changes just so you can see the catalog. Let's go to image adjustments. We'll go to levels, and we'll make a couple of quick changes to the image and then hit OK. Now we have levels built into the catalog. We'll go back to image adjustments, hue and saturation. We're going to increase the overall saturation of the file. Now we have hue saturation built into it. So I am working non-destructively. Even though I'm making changes to the file, I'm working non-destructively because now I can go back to any of these and start changing them and undo what I did. I can turn them on and off so that we can see the file without that hue saturation change or the levels change. I can go back into the dialog for both of them and make those changes. Here for the Camera Raw filter, if I double click it, this is just warning me that ultimately the way it's going to preview and show me a live view of what's happening may not work as well because we had other filters we've turned off. Because again, this is kind of speaking to the idea that it is making changes to the file, but not technically, because it's building that catalog and it's trying to give you a live view of what it will do. It will have its final change when we rasterize the smart object back to a normal layer or just simply flatten this and save it. Anytime you undo the smart object to become a normal layer, then everything that was built into that catalog is pushed into the pixels itself. So here, once we're back in Adobe Camera Raw, here's the sharpening that we did. I can decrease this just a little bit. I can increase it even more. Why is that important? Let's say I'm working on this for a commercial company. I send all of my work off to the marketing team of the commercial company and they say, oh, hey, this looks great on our computers, but it's just overly sharp when we put it on a billboard or a magazine. We've got to change the sharpness. Well, I sent them a file that has smart objects in it. Their marketing team, knowing how to use Photoshop, can just simply go in and double click Camera Raw filter and reduce the sharpening. They have the freedom to be able to do that because I built this working non-destructively. That's why it's so powerful, and that's why smart objects are so commonly used for that, because it's a way to protect all of the data and be able to build up a list of things you've done so you can undo or change and continue to get all of that control over the artwork itself. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK to get out of Adobe Camera Raw and back into Photoshop. So that's the journey today in episode 7 of the shop vlog of editing this image artistically, overcoming some of the issues that we saw of the natural light, being able to use a program that is a bridge between Photoshop and Lightroom. So let's finish up this video today with some final thoughts. I want to be brief with the final comments since this video is long. Keep pushing your journey in both digital photography and digital photo editing. Experimentation is key. Understanding using the fundamentals of color, luminosity, and detail is where you can begin. Whether you're using Adobe Lightroom or Luminar, Color Effects Pro from DxO, whatever, Photoshop, go on the journey and don't stop learning. Don't stop pushing yourself. Find time every week to edit for an hour or two. Use Bridge, use Adobe Camera Raw as the bridge, use Lightroom, and keep exploring all the possibilities following that vision. Let me know in the comments below anything that doesn't make sense to you in this video today or the questions that you might have. I've been creating content based upon the questions that folks have been asking on the channel in the past few videos, as well as the regular scheduled content that I have planned out. I will go with you on your journey of education and art. I will help you as I can. Ask me those questions, let me know in those comments below. Thanks so much for watching today. If you like the content you found in the video, make sure to give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel, because new content debuts each week in photography and Photoshop education. And when you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of that new content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.